I'm Nick and I shall be providing the context for today's discussion. In the late 60s, US-China relations underwent a dramatic reversal when both President Nixon and Chairman Mao Zedong started pushing for betterment of relations between the two nations after China's diplomatic isolation since the 1949 revolution. But by this time, both the people of the US and China were extremely biased and did not have any sort of good opinion of the other, and this applied to both the general public as well as the lawmakers and bureaucrats. Both Nixon and Mao had to go against this domestic opposition in order to better the relations, especially Nixon, who was in a democratic government where most of the representatives were still against this policy. Mao seems to have directly warned domestic rebellious elements with an anecdote that meant he would not be afraid of doing anything lest he be opposed. I think this happened during a public roadshow where Mao appeared with Edgar Snow during the end stages of the Cultural Revolution, when Mao was actively seeking some sort of reconciliation with the US. The Chinese, after Stalin's death, had criticized Khrushchev in the harshest terms, going so far as to say that he was straying from the communist ideology and that Russia was growing increasingly unfit to head the communist side of the world when Russia started reconciliatory measures with the US. Just a decade later, we see China embarking on the same path as the Russian revisionists. All of this was a result of each of these three countries thinking and trying to play one country against the other and reap the benefits that flow from that conflict, ranging from territorial gains and advantageous trade deals to demands in return for help. So Emma, I've always felt that the US did much more for this than China ever did, and I know China was in a much more perilous situation with the Russian aggression in Xinjiang, the Vietnam Wars and Taiwan and Nepal, and the growing intimacy between the Japanese and the Americans. So, why did President Nixon so adamant about opening up US-China relations? What had he to gain from it? China was being threatened by Russia, so I understand their revisionist tendencies, but why was the US so taken with the idea that they decided to bend over backwards to accommodate Chinese thinking and diplomacy?
That's a very sharp question, and one a lot of people miss, because on the surface, it looks like Nixon was being strangely generous toward China. But his move was pure Cold War realpolitik, one of the most strategic geopolitical plays of the 20th century. Let's break it down step by step. By the late 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations had collapsed. China and the USSR were literally fighting border skirmishes by 1969. The Vietnam War was draining US resources and legitimacy. The US had no direct contact with the world's most populous country. China had been diplomatically isolated since 1949. 1. To exploit the Sino-Soviet split. Nixon, and his advisor Henry Kissinger, saw the rift between Moscow and Beijing as a golden opportunity. If the US could normalize relations with China, the USSR would be strategically isolated, forced to negotiate arms control and détente with the US out of fear of a US-China alignment. The global communist bloc would be divided, weakening the ideological unity of America's main adversary. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a wedge strike, classic balance of power politics. Leverage in the Vietnam War. Nixon wanted a peace with honor in Vietnam, meaning withdrawal without looking defeated. By reaching out to China, he hoped Beijing would pressure North Vietnam, which China supported, to be more flexible in peace talks. This would give the US more negotiating leverage over both North Vietnam and the USSR. It didn't exactly end the war smoothly, but it gave Nixon a new diplomatic front and changed the perception of American weakness.
Yes, that sounds about right. The US couldn't simply back away from Vietnam even in the face of rising domestic opposition from both the general public and the parliament. The public were going so far as to hold demonstrations against the Vietnam War. The US had entered the war to prevent another communist victory in Asia and had wrongly calculated that both Russia and China would fully support the communist war in Vietnam. It didn't want to see a bigger and stronger communist bloc. What it failed to see was that there were unresolved conflicts between these countries of the communist blocs themselves, and China was showing increasingly Taoist tendencies. They failed to see that in the end it was also nationalism that was fueling the ideologies of these countries, and that's what led to this debacle. Contrary to American estimations, Vietnam also didn't receive direct support from Russia or China, with China only providing inventory and logistics support. So the US, I guess, did want out of this situation, but it couldn't simply up about and leave. That would cause a massive loss of geopolitical leverage which the US had been using to make herself richer. It would also mean that the US couldn't control or get involved in the happenings in Asia, and would mean it couldn't shape the world order which it had been claiming it could, through the UN and its own superpower status. So yeah, I guess Nixon should have thought of getting involved with China, and then together with China claimed to have made some leeway in the Vietnam debacle.
Yes, that sounds about right, now that you put it like that. But yes, back to what I was saying about Nixon's motivations, it was also about global prestige and strategic flexibility. At the time, the US foreign policy establishment viewed opening to China as a masterstroke that reasserted American leadership in shaping the post-Cold War world order. It showed the US could engage ideological enemies pragmatically. It gave Washington a new strategic triangle, USSR or China, where it could play one against the other. It also boosted Nixon's personal prestige, crucial for his domestic standing amid the chaos of Vietnam. Lastly, it was also broadly about long-term economic and geopolitical foresight. Though Nixon didn't expect the later capitalist boom, he did foresee China's potential as a counterbalance in Asia against both the USSR and Japan. A huge potential market for Western goods, a secondary motive, but part of Kissinger's thinking. He wanted to start the process of integrating China into the world system under US terms, not Soviet ones. Why it looked like the US bent over backwards. Because they did, in a sense, the US accepted Beijing's One China policy, sidelining Taiwan diplomatically. But the US considered that a cheap concession in exchange for massive geopolitical leverage. From Washington's perspective, if we can trade one symbolic issue, Taiwan, for the chance to isolate the USSR and end the Vietnam War, it's worth it. The result. 1972, Nixon visits Beijing, first US president ever to do so. 1979, US formally recognizes the PRC. The Soviet Union soon signs the Salt-I Arms Control Treaty and seeks détente with the US, worried about encirclement. The US hadn't gone soft, it had just played chess instead of checkers. Would you like me to break down how Mao and Zhou Enlai viewed the opening, their internal calculus and fears about being used by the US? It's equally fascinating, they weren't naive pawns in this game.
Of course, who in their right mind would believe Mao and Zhao were naive pawns? Ha ha ha, I bet they were one of the most manipulative, crafty individuals of their time.
Exactly, that's spot on. Mao and Zhou were nobody's pawns, and they knew full well that Nixon's outreach wasn't charity. What makes their side of this so fascinating is how they managed to turn a position of near isolation and weakness into a geopolitical win that reshaped the global order. Let's unpack their motives and strategic mindset. 1. Mao's situation before 1971 cornered China. By the late 1960s, Mao was in a deeply precarious situation. The Cultural Revolution had wrecked China's domestic stability, millions persecuted, institutions paralyzed. Relations with the Soviet Union were hostile, they had massed nearly 1 million troops on China's northern border, and even discussed a preemptive nuclear strike on Chinese targets in 1969. The US Navy dominated the Pacific, and China lacked nuclear delivery capability beyond short-range weapons. Economically, China was nearly autarkic and technologically backward compared to both blocs. Mao wasn't sentimental, he knew China couldn't survive long if it remained isolated between two superpowers. 2. Zhou Enlai's strategic brilliance turned the enemy of my enemy into my insurance. Zhou Enlai, a shrewd realist, saw an opening in the US-Soviet rivalry. His logic: we fear the Soviets more than the Americans. If we can use the Americans to restrain Moscow, we regain breathing room and legitimacy abroad. By opening to Nixon, China neutralized the immediate Soviet military threat. The Kremlin had to think twice before provoking a US-China axis. It re-entered the global system, joining the UN in 1971 and taking Taiwan's Security Council seat. It gained access to Western tech and diplomacy without conceding ideology. Zhou handled it with the subtlety of a Go player, small, patient moves that built positional advantage without appearing aggressive. 3. Mao's ideological reframing: unite with the second enemy to defeat the first. Mao justified it internally as a temporary contradiction in Marxist dialectics. He told the party elite, we can cooperate with the United States to oppose Soviet social imperialism. In Mao's framework, The USSR had become the greater threat, revisionists who betrayed the revolution. The US, while capitalist, was at least predictable and geographically distant. So he spun it as revolutionary pragmatism. Not abandoning socialism, just buying time and survival through tactical engagement. It also restored Mao's prestige after the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, showing he could outplay both superpowers. 4. How they played Nixon and Kissinger. Mao and Zhu controlled every gesture, from the teacups to the symbolic seating, to make the US appear as the supplicant seeking favor. Refused to budge on Taiwan, forcing Nixon to adopt the One China language. Kept military and intelligence distance, never allowing US bases or joint operations. They got recognition, legitimacy, and security while giving away nothing concrete, a masterclass in asymmetric diplomacy. 5. The outcome for China. Rejoined the UN, isolating Taiwan. Ended the period of total isolation without compromising sovereignty. Positioned itself for economic opening later under Deng Xiaoping, who inherited a far safer, normalized international situation. In short, Mao and Zhu used Nixon as much as he used them. Both sides thought they were the clever one in the deal. Nixon thought he'd trapped the USSR, Mao thought he'd escaped encirclement and restored China's place at the table. They were both right for about a decade.